Hey, everyone.
Hey, Sam. Looks like Ashley is just joining the stage, and then I think we can jump in. I'll say a couple quick words and introduce the hosts here. First off, I'm Al from Koii. With me here, we have Sam Williams, the founder of Arweave, which is a decentralized storage network that provides permanent storage for over 200 years for any file that you put onto it. And Ashley Rindsberg, the author of Grey Lady Winked and an open free speech advocate. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today, this will be a fairly open discussion, but the main point is just to discuss kind of what the other options are. You know, we're seeing kind of the limits of social media. We're seeing people like Elon have to step in and fix sort of the ongoing problems with these networks. And the question is, if the only option right now is to privatize these things, how do we eventually have more user governance over time? And how do we kind of work backwards towards a more open and decentralized system? So if you're interested in learning more about Arweave, that's arweave.org. And I think Ashley probably has a website that he can post as well. But please check out the speakers and their bios as well, and you can follow them here on Twitter, of course. So I guess without further ado, I can quickly let you introduce yourself, Sam, since you're already on as a speaker, and we'll wait for Ashley to join. Do you want to say a couple words about Arweave and the problems we're trying to solve?
Sure, thanks for having me on. So as you described, Arweave is a permanent information storage system. The idea is to scale up on-chain storage from blockchains to make it so that you can fit arbitrary amounts of data inside, and then make it reliable to store that data for exceedingly long periods of time. It starts at 200 years, but as the cost of storage declines, that 200 years expands out. So the endowment that backs Arweave right now has storage costs for, I think, 500, 600 years in it already. The problem we're trying to solve is to make it so that, well, few fundamental problems. The first is that we want to make it so that nobody can rewrite history fundamentally, such that everyone can access, we say, information from the past in a way that they can be sure has not been corrupted or changed over time or lost. And we believe that this is important because in the development of authoritarian regimes, there comes a moment, and I frankly fear that this is what we're seeing across the West right now, even, where you need to clamp down control of the information space. And the reason for that is best explained by George Orwell, who said, the person that controls the present controls the past, and by controlling the past, they control the future. That is, by controlling the way that people think about the past, you change the frame in which they relate to themselves and the present moment, and subsequently how they act. And by changing how they act, you can change the future. We want to make it so that there's democratic control over information about the past, so that nobody can take no single group of people can change the way people think about the future. So that's what we've been working on. We started the project almost 5 years ago now, I guess, almost to the week. And the network itself went live about 4 years ago. And by now we have about 250 million pieces of data stored on the network, which are replicated around the world on thousands of nodes. We're well into the mission, you could say. I think the thing we're most focused on now is ramping up in the sort of consumer application facing space. So building web applications that are stored inside this system that mean that you're unable to change people's access to them. So imagine you see like this UI that we're all looking at right now, the Twitter. Well, what if it was served in a way that no single person had control over, or no single group of people had control over? And then the information inside that can also be decentralized across the network. And there's a few examples of these applications in practice, but we're just starting to ramp up. We're planning to fund the next 1,000 founders on top of this system through our Arweave.build program. And fund them for $100,000 each over the next 18 months. We're really like hitting the accelerate on that. So that's a little bit about Arweave and what we're focused on.
Thanks. It's very exciting to see these things ramping up at the time that we're in now in the world. It seems like if we don't get this moving soon, we might be in a very bad spot. And this isn't to say as well, for anybody that's just tuning in, it's not to say that we don't necessarily trust current leadership of social media networks or the intentions that they may have to keep these networks accountable, but that over time, this creates kind of an existential risk to the information that lives on these networks, because you can only trust governance for so long before eventually you see corruption. And so the more transparent we can make these systems and the more we can build out the underlying technologies so that they can be run, operated by the community, then the more powerful these systems become as systems of thought and speech. It looks like Ashley is still having some trouble getting on as a speaker. In the meantime, just while we're kind of waiting for him, I will talk a little bit about Koii. The main thing that we want to kind of provide for anybody that's coming into the Koii ecosystem and for any of you who are listening is the tools to be able to kind of try out these kinds of systems. So we've built a bunch of wallet technology to make it very easy to mint your own content onto Arweave. And we provide a stream of attention rewards, which is our new token called Koii, that you can actually earn by getting attention from other people. And we see this as a way of kind of tracking the open knowledge graph of society, because we can then see who is looking at what, and we keep all this information transparently actually on Arweave as well. So it can be indexed and you can use it for all sorts of other stuff. The main thing that I'm really curious to get your thoughts on, Sam, would be around kind of the governance of these systems over time. How can we look at electing leaders to kind of take control of these things? Or do we need a leader? Is it possible that we can automate most of this? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that the first layer of the stack comes with, what do you call it, like physical space governments, right? So having democratic control of the societies that we live in, we more or less still do. Allowing them to govern speech, I think, is the most important thing. So the way that Arweave works is it says that everybody is incentivized to store everything that's committed to the network, but everybody is also responsible for everything that they store. And subsequently, if something is illegal in the jurisdiction in which you are storing it, then you're taking an enormous risk and then subsequently generating a massive disincentive by storing that data. And so you get the sort of applications that expose the rule of law at the user level. And so a basic Arweave application would only do this, right? So you access metaweave.xyz, for example, and the only laws you're being exposed to are the laws of the land in which the data is being served from. There are other things we can do in the middle if we want to. So for example, we can build programmatically applications that let users, and whether that's coin voting or one person, one vote with Sybil resistance systems, allowing people to decide basically what they do and don't want in their space. That's totally possible. You can also do stuff like allowing people to use gateways which are more conservative or less conservative, depending on their preferences, and that essentially allows the application not to be changed, but the information shown inside that application to be changed. And that's at the user's discretion. So I would say the core of all of this, though, is that these applications can be written in such a fashion that they expose just the rule of law, just the government level censorship, frankly, to users, or they can be written in a way where the users get more control between themselves as a community or individually, but those rules are upfront and transparent. Like you can't take a permaweb app back after you've published it and change it, swap it out for another one. And so you get this sort of, we call it consumer integrity guarantee. Basically, once the application is out there, it can never be taken away from you. They can release a new version of the application which you might want to use, but you can't be forced to use it, which is a really fundamental change in the way these applications work, and we think puts a lot of the control back in the hands of the users. That's at least what we're focusing on.
Yeah, I really like the aspect of censorship prevention there as well. It's kind of the adage that there is only one solution to preventing bad speech, which is having more good speech as well, to kind of counter the narrative, to allow people to kind of say what they think, but then to also try to make sure that there is truth also within the spectrum. One of the things that I found really exciting about the Arweave ecosystem is the ability to store all of the content of these applications independently from the applications themselves, so that you can have the client, which is how people are viewing the content, be somewhat separated from the data store. And so if a particular platform doesn't want particular types of content to show up in the newsfeed, for example, it doesn't mean that the content gets deleted. It just means that it doesn't show up in the newsfeed. And maybe somebody else makes another website where that content is going to be more popular or more accepted. Just got a notice from Ashley. He's switching to the mobile app, so he's going to probably hop on in a second. We can widen the discussion a little bit beyond Arweave. But just while we have you and we get to pick your brain about Arweave, are there any big things coming up in the Arweave community that people might want to hear about?
Yeah, a ton of stuff. I mean, we're working on a number of different archiving campaigns. So the thing that got us into building Arweave in the first place was this idea of building a censorship-resistant archive of newspaper articles, actually. And this is a conversation I've wanted to have with Ashley for a long time. But that goes both ways, right? Like we wanted to make sure that no authoritarian government can shut down newspapers and stop them speaking. But we also wanted to make sure that those newspapers were held accountable for what it was that they say. I'm reminded of the recent New York Times article about the death of a Weather Underground activist, where the obituary first read, I believe it was Weather Underground member who was involved in I think it was a robbery, or was it some sort of bombing back in the 80s or 70s or even 60s perhaps, is found dead, unfortunately. But then they changed it very quickly to another headline which said, only nice things, didn't mention this bombing they were part of. And we want to make it so that, if you put information out there into the information space, you are held accountable for it. You can't just change the past. You can't unsay things said in public. Like that is the point of public speech. I think free speech goes both ways. It is both a right, but also a responsibility to use it properly. And that's kind of, what the network is focused on. So we've been archiving huge amounts of data out of Ukraine as a community, something like, I would guess, 50 to 60 million pieces of data so far. Hey, Ashley, you're on the stage now.
Hi, everybody. So sorry about that. I was on desktop foolishly. So
I've done that too many times to
we learn something new every day.
Why wouldn't let me be a speaker? Where's the button? Everyone's asking me to press the button.
And why can't you be a speaker on desktop? Anyways.
Right, that's a fascinating question.
Maybe a good note for our new benevolent dictator of Twitter that we should probably increase the desktop compatibility.
Yeah, which is sort of to the point of the conversation. But you were talking about Weather Underground, which is a very interesting conversation. So please continue.
Well, I mean, I was just mentioning how the New York Times was changing their headlines, I guess, as a result of the feedback they got. But by the way, a huge fan of your book, The Grey Lady Wings. I read it recently with my partner. It was fascinating.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's right. They did change their headline. They changed the tweet. There was a tweet about one of the Weather Underground founders, which was sort of a radical terror group from the 60s, 70s, 80s, which President Obama had some affiliation with a couple of the other members. And their initial tweet said that they would rob banks and things, and they robbed a security, like one of those Brinks money trucks, and in the process they killed the security guard. So the initial tweet said that this woman, whose name escapes me for the moment, but she Kathy Boudin, that initially the tweet said she had killed or murdered this security guard, and then that went away, and then suddenly the new tweet appears saying that the guard died in the process of the robbery, like as if it's some sort of surgery that was collateral damage. So yeah, that's a problem, and that's a problem. We tend to think of media when we all having this conversation about media and the media. We all think about CNN and New York Times and etc. But we really can't separate the media or media today from social media because they're so embedded. And of course, the news media is the fuel that keeps social media running. Without fresh stories, we have no fresh controversies, which means we have no fresh conversations. So there's a real symbiosis there. And that's where a lot of the controversy around media and social media that's popped up recently has come from this symbiosis, meaning when Twitter censors a New York Post article at the behest of who knows who, that again is part of the expanded media, that we really need to start reframing how we define media from traditional news media to this huge ecosystem of players that spans tech, to an extent government, of course, and entertainment and other sectors and other sectors and industries that really play a vital role. So that's just kind of one of these points that I've tried to hammer home recently, is like expanding our definition of media.
I really like that angle, actually. I want to touch on one thing you said, and then I'd like to really get your background and the bigger picture of what you're thinking about, because I know that you've been looking at this problem from a very different standpoint. And Sam and I are both very technical people. But one thing that you just said, which is really interesting, is this like kind of the finger on the scale problem, right? And it's, a lot of the time when we hear this discussion, it's like, oh, you know, someone at XYZ organization, potentially a conspiracy. It sounds like very big brothery, but actually it's really kind of, it's not that complicated, right? As soon as there is some kind of a review process for this content, as soon as there is a way for these things to get taken down, then there's a large organization of people that are involved in that. And so somebody's going to get asked for a favor at some point, and someone's going to potentially even think that they're doing the right thing by making these decisions. And as soon as there is this ability to censor, or there is this kind of centralized control, then that becomes a problem. But just wanted to touch on that. But I'd really love to think, like, in a bigger sense, you know, this problem of media, what do you think the solution could be? Is there a solution in sight, or are we doomed?
I do think there is a solution in sight. I think we're seeing the solution unfold. And just to jump back to the point you were making right now, Al, about how this kind of really corruption, let's call it what it is. It's corruption. When someone is saying this story or this language doesn't suit our agenda, please change it, and then that happens, and the people who lose out is the rest of us. That is corruption. It's a polite form of corruption, and it really does work through just relationships. It is not some big bad conspiracy theory of like people, sipping whiskey in plush rooms, like, though that does happen too. This is really just people who know each other because they all work together or have worked together. For example, the woman who initially ran Twitter's news department when they launched that was a former CEO of NPR, and she was really high up NBC. She now runs the Aspen Institute, and she just knows the people, right? So it's not a stretch for anyone at the New York Times or within the Biden administration or wherever this is coming from to say, hey, person, could you just make this adjustment for us? That would be awesome. We're really thinking this is problematic, and I'm sure you understand. And the other person thinks, well, I definitely want to keep my relationship with this person from the Biden administration, from the publisher in the New York Times, good and warm and happy. So sure, I'll do that. And that's how this stuff gets done. But in terms of the broader question of media and what looks like the apocalypse, the media apocalypse that's been unfolding for the last however long, 5 years or whatever it is, I think we are watching the solutions forming in front of our eyes in real time. So, something I really loved that Twitter released yesterday as a proposal, I don't know if it's happening or not, is the ability to kind of create a small room or a little sort of section of Twitter with 150 people whom you designate to be a part of that group. Because part of the reason Twitter can be so horrible and nasty and gross is that you've got people who have nothing in common. So in college, I studied the philosophy and history of science, and one of the huge defining books in that whole field is Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he comes up with the famous term paradigm shift. And one thing that Kuhn was saying in how paradigm shifts in science occur is that you go through a process where the previous scientific regime and the current one that has come up with some new ground-changing theory, game-changing theory, are no longer commensurate with one each other. They're using the same words technically, but they're actually speaking different languages. They can't communicate. And that's what is happening on Twitter. It's like we all think we're communicating in some way, but we are so far apart from most of the people there that we're not using the same terminology. We don't define it the same way. We have drastically different values, and that's okay. That was not a problem until we suddenly all ended up in the same space at the same time with no way to distinguish who is who, and it's just mayhem and bedlam. So these little incremental changes, I think, are part of the solution. I don't think it's the solution that this is going to solve Twitter's problems, but small things like this. And with regard to traditional media, what we're seeing is this kind of flattening effect. So one of the big stories of last week was this New York Times hit piece, really, on Tucker Carlson. That they're just like, Tucker Carlson is a white supremacist and a racist and whatever they called him. But was something that I saw Glenn Greenwald point out is that 10, 20 years ago, that would have been game over for Tucker Carlson. New York Times prints that kind of stuff, those allegations against anyone, you're done. Today, Tucker could just hold the newspaper, that day's edition of the New York Times, in front of him, smiling, and think of it as a joke, because it kind of is. So what this means is that we've got this flattening effect where the New York Times and the Washington Post are no longer king and queen of the media universe. They're players, but there are now thousands of other players that matter almost as much, or just as much, or in some cases more than they do. And I think probably Tucker Carlson matters more than they do in some ways, which is why they hate him so much, in part. And I think that's part of the solution too, is that we used to have a media that was not just centralized, it was nothing but centralized. New York Times called all the shots for the rest of the media. They set the news agenda. That's the famous phrasing of their power. They not only set the news agenda, but they would syndicate their content and license their content to thousands and thousands of other news organizations around the world. And so they would print a story, and that would be the story for everybody. Today, we are seeing a kind of fracturing effect. And one sort of unintended consequence of that is that there's a lot of din, there's a lot of noise, because people are arguing about which is the true story. But the upside, of course, is that we have more space for different kinds of perspectives. And we're able to have just crypto media, just crypto news, which is great because you're speaking to a group of people who can just understand your language and relate to your values. And even though you're going to have disagreements, but the basic worldview is broad enough and coherent enough for us to at least talk. We are not speaking in an incommensurate way. We're not speaking past each other. And I think that is the solution to, this is where we're going. We're going to micro audiences. And that's something, if people know Seth Godin, the great marketing guru, philosopher, thinker, he talks about how TV is like the classic, and newspapers too, but really TV is the classic mass media format, because you really had 3 networks in America until cable, and everybody watched them, and you would, one show would talk to 20, 40, 50 million people at a time. It was insane. When the internet came along and news tried to figure out what it was doing online, they just took the mass media model and tried to transplant it onto the internet. And that completely doesn't work, because the internet is not a mass media format. It's not a mass channel. It's a micro channel. It's a niche channel. It's a channel where you can really speak to 20 to 30 people who are actually interested in what you have to say. And in TV, you would never be able to tailor a message to, forget 20, 30, or even 200 or 300, or even 2,000 or 3,000. You really couldn't talk to less than 200,000 or 300,000. You had to have a message that was so broad that it would be either completely watered down or just saying nothing. Whereas the internet and the news that's online, the kind of information media that's online, is perfectly geared to micro audiences. And I think that is really where this is all going.
That makes a ton of sense, actually. And that gives me a lot of faith that the modern Tower of Babel may actually be less of the tower falling down and more of a bunch of smaller towers being built, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah.
I think sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, it's the development of what was almost peer-to-peer media. So it strikes me as like, before the internet, and actually before social media in particular, there was sort of broadcast media, and that had held from basically the creation of the Gutenberg press, right? Like, there was always this dynamic where a very small number of people had access to the means to speak to an extremely large number of people, and that extremely large number of people didn't really have the means to speak to anyone other than their kind of close network of literally, friends in physical space, co-workers. And then along came social media, and you kind of got peer-to-peer media for the first time. Like, people could speak, and then other people could hear them, and they could lend their voices to that speech. I think like the retweet is probably the most, or at least one of the most underrated inventions of the last 20 years. It's pretty remarkable, because it allows you to organize crowds of people with no particular authority structure into a vaguely sensible way of listening to each other. And you just do it by lending your speech to things you believe in. So there's that side of it. But then what appeared to happen after, it was kind of starting to happen after 2014, 2015, really ramped up under Trump and then went haywire during the pandemic, was this re-centralization process where basically the old media organizations started to demand power back over the information space, and they kind of largely got it, actually until last week, where, and you know, by that I mean, well, like, if you want to say something that is against the line of the, quote, authoritative sources, unquote, on Twitter or Facebook, you'd have a hard time doing so. Key examples being, you know, coronavirus origin story. If you asked a question about that on Facebook, you'd be banned. And why would you be banned? Well, because the media, the traditional media had concluded with you know, disregard for the truth, frankly, but they'd concluded that it just wasn't a story worth talking about. And if you tried to talk about it, you wouldn't be allowed. But by the end of the pandemic, we were in this situation where the trusted media organizations were back in control of the information space. And then suddenly, last week, you know, Twitter sells to Elon, or at least, you know, we expect that's going to happen. And frankly, it's all up in the air again. Who knows what will happen? But I think that Elon might just be a stepping stone in the direction we really want to go to, which is community and user-controlled information space. Anyway, I'm afraid I actually have to jump in a couple of minutes, but it was amazing to talk to you.
Sam, one last thing before you go, because I know we're running up on time, and I want to open it up to the community as well to potentially jump on and say their piece. But for each of you, I'd love to know if you have any things that you would like to see that would make Twitter better in the future. I know you've each mentioned a couple of them, but just like some quick points, what would you like to see from Twitter to make it a more open platform to ensure it will survive for the long term?
I think fundamentally we need it to be ownerless. Like, it has to be that you are guaranteed the right to speak as long as someone out there is willing to host your speech. Like, it is far too important service. It's essentially a public utility. You know, like, one way of thinking about it is that we used to organize almost completely in physical space. In fact, actually before computers, totally in physical space. But then slowly over the last like 60 years or so, we've moved increasingly into cyberspace. Until, you know, now the pandemic and post-pandemic period, where most people are spending more time in cyberspace than they are in physical space. But in physical space, our speech rights were guaranteed by law. But in cyberspace, because of the way the protocols worked, we had to depend on companies. And companies, by the virtue of the way that we set up the legal system, and I think this is probably right, actually have the ability to censor your speech. Because, like, you can't come onto my property and then go spouting your mouth off about whatever you want and then say, no, that's free speech, man. Like, no, it's my private property, get lost. So I think it's their right to say that. But the problem is that cyberspace was structured so that we could only have private spaces. I think the future of cyberspace has to include public spaces, and obviously Twitter will be one of those. And I would hope that it ends up on Arweave. That's my bit.
Lovely. So public ownership of the space is what enables true freedom of speech.
Yep.
Nice. That's a very succinct way of thinking about it. Ashley, any last takeaways before we kind of open it up to the community feedback?
I think on that last point, first, Sam's point about the retweet, that was a great point of being this sort of almost like the like, which gets a lot more attention as an innovation. But in terms of making Twitter a better place or a better space, I think a lot of it is to do with responsibility and finding mechanisms to enforce responsibility for speech. So in the case of journalists, for example, a big pet peeve of mine or gripe of mine, or maybe it's bigger than that, is that journalists who are verified as journalists, you see them all the time just deleting their tweets in mass sometimes. I mean, there is a journalist at The Atlantic who deletes all of her tweets on a regular basis. So we have no journalistic record of what this person is saying. And that is something that I feel like just could never fly in the non-Twitter universe. And it happens all the time among journalists who are basically amending the record or tampering with the chain of custody, and again, this is a journalistic record, they are verified as journalists. So I feel like there's an element of responsibility that if you are presenting yourself as a journalist on Twitter, there should be a trade-off. It's not just that you get a certain privilege, which is this really nice looking badge next to your name. There also needs to be responsibilities and obligations that come along with it. But I also think that applies to general users. I mean, I think people who are attacking others willy-nilly because they're hiding behind this cloak of anonymity is a big problem. There's no responsibility for speech, and that lends them to speaking in ways that they would never speak. They would never speak in those ways of speaking if they were accountable. And which is not to say I'm in favor of everyone revealing their identity on Twitter. I don't think that's the solution either. And Elon Musk has also spoken to this tension, the need for accountability, but also the need to preserve some degree of anonymity. And this is something Balaji Srinivasan has spoken to as well, which maybe there is something that is not your identity, but is a sub-identity or alter identity that is connected to a reputation that moves with you. So if you come on Twitter and accuse someone of X or Y, or issue some bit of hate speech or whatever it is, that will damage your reputation online, and that is something that you will have to take. And I'm guessing that blockchain would be a major part of that solution, so that the reputation stays intact and is immutable. So I think there is a lot that we can do conceptually, and it feels like we're at this point where we have the technology to do it for the first time. So again, I see a lot of hope, and I completely agree with Sam that like we hit a turning point over the last 2 weeks, and you can feel it in the air. I don't think this is the only thing precipitating that turning point. I think it's a broader cultural shift, but you really feel like we've pivoted with the Musk stuff, with the change in tone on Twitter and off Twitter as well. So I'm excited to see what's coming.
Me too. Me too. I think there's the thing you mentioned about trying to keep a public record of some kind is very important, because this is effectively the court of public opinions, right? And if you're going to be a lawyer and go into court and represent people, there is a stenographer and they take records, and that's how we keep it fair. And so if we're going to have this public discourse and have this like open forum, we kind of have to have some way of recording what's actually being said. I want to invite at this point anybody who's listening to hop up and potentially ask a question or say their piece as well. But just while we're waiting for them, Ashley, kind of curious to see what you see happening on a bigger scale outside of the Twitter space, because I know like we've been talking a lot about social media, but are you seeing any hope on the like the broader journalistic side? Substack options like that tend to be very empowering, but is there anything else out there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Substack is huge. This drive for like, major journalists, like people who have big reputations, a lot of history and experience, going out to do their own thing and to do so responsibly, it sort of breaks the narrative. And the narrative is not just the political narrative. The narrative is that only we, and we being New York Post, New York Times, Washington Post, whoever else, CNN, only we are able to do this special magical thing. It's like they've created this like class, this mystical class of people that only they can do it. But then you have Barry Weiss, or you have an Andrew Sullivan, or you have a Glenn Greenwald doing actual journalism on Substack independently. And it is often better than what you get from the big boys. So I think that's another big thing. And I also feel like we're just in this point where we're going through a regime change, and it's not a political regime change in media. I mean, it's a regime change from the institutional and corporate to the independent. And again, when we look at Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball, who were on the Hill Rising, which was a pretty big digital TV show, and now they have their own show, which is completely independent. It's them doing it, and it is a huge and important show. And same thing with the All In podcast. Those guys are doing something really important. You listen to these things and you learn something, and I feel like that's the key. Is that I can go on to a network news channel and I can get all the talking points, whether that's from the GOP or the DNC. I'll get the talking points. I'll get all of them, and I'll get them like as much as I want, and it'll be pretty awful. But if I go to these other places, I might learn something that has not been included in the narrative, or I might get an opinion that is not either or. And I think that's an important thing, is that in especially in American politics and culture, we're very used to the like black and white. Like the abortion thing is a great example. It's like either you're just, you know, baby murderer, or you're like robbing women of their hard-earned rights, and there's no nuance. But when you skip out of the mainstream media and go to the independent people who have less at stake financially and who are able to offer, they're not chasing the ratings, they don't need to. They're offering something much more nuanced and subtle and much more middle of the road. It's a return to common sense, which not coincidentally is the name of Barry Weiss's Substack. So I think that is very, very heartening as well, to see a return to the middle.
I really like that as well. Yeah, the going direct seems to be an amazing way to introduce new moral authorities into the fabric, because there's kind of this thing where, actually, I think I've noticed this trying to step outside the American bubble. Sometimes you start to notice that in the rest of the world, it's not actually as black and white all the time. And I think possibly the cause of that, I haven't looked into this too closely, but I think the cause of that could be that America has mostly grown under mass media. You know, very early on, there were already very strong publications, and then radio, television, and now the internet. And so actually it's kind of a social experiment to see if you can have one moral authority. And it seems to be that you can't. But a lot of these, like, you know, you mentioned the All In Pod and a lot of these other kind of direct content creators, and they seem to build their following mostly because they have a certain amount of, they establish their moral authorities through a strong track record and through the respect of a lot of followers, which seems to actually be a new way of finding that kind of moral compass, which is really interesting, actually, because, you know, if you think 500 years ago, it was basically religion. That was pretty much the only moral compass we had. So it's very nice to see this kind of evolution happening. How do you think we keep things stable as we go through that change, right? Because usually when you have a massive shift like that in society, a lot of stuff gets broken in the process.
I don't know that we really can keep any desired level of stability, because the media still plays such an enormous role in culture and politics. So if we were all just to like agree to limit our media consumption to, like, you know, 90 minutes a week or whatever the number is, I think that would help. But until that point happens, which I don't think it ever will, there's going to be a lot of instability. There is going to be this process of creative destruction. I can't see a way out of it. You know, creative destruction is traditionally an economic concept, but of course, this is also, there's also an economics to all of this. So we are witnessing the destruction of traditional media structures and formats and business models, and audiences, of course. And part of that destruction is just rubble, mess, dust, and sometimes you're going to get bloodied, which is exactly what's happening in American society. That doesn't mean there is not a path out of it. So sometimes we think apocalypse and that's the end point, but just as often as not, it's a rebirth. And I think that is a lot of what's going on.
I certainly hope that's correct. Hopefully it's a bit of a phoenix rising from the ashes without too many ashes, but
Yeah.
goes. I would say so far the internet seems to have resulted in a lot more widespread criticism of things that used to be the status quo. But I think the thing that's also tricky is it feels kind of like an autoimmune disorder. It's almost like the criticism engine is effective in some cases, but then you get kind of an overzealous criticism group that don't actually even really understand what they're doing. They're just kind of there to fight with everybody. Sort of the troll community, if you would. I'd love to find a way to sort of gradually move them out of the focus. I think sort of the stuff that you're talking about with smaller communities could be a good example of that, though, because trolls don't play as well in that kind of space.
Right. And I think that's kind of what will happen, is that these audiences will, bit by bit, they will kind of erode the mass audience, erode, just as Twitter, I think over time is what we'll see, is that people just don't want to be in a place where you've got whatever number of million of other people at the same time arguing their own thing. That's one of the weirdest phenomena to me, is just like scrolling through my Twitter feed, like my homepage, and just seeing like this person's arguing about immigration, this one's going on about trans rights, this person's talking about Biden, this person's talking about Israel, the next guy's talking about, it's like this insane stew of stuff, and 90% of it I don't care about, and 99% of it I don't care about right now. So one thing I've observed with this shift that we're seeing in media is that a lot of us are going from browse which is really like a Web 1, Web 2 modality to search. And you would go from like just looking at the news aggregator on Yahoo or Drudge or whatever to the point where you're like, I'm just going to search for what I'm interested in, which some people are doing, not all, of course. But I think that's where things need to go on social media as well. Like right now, we're just kind of doing browse, where we just scroll down, scroll down, scroll down, scroll down, see what's there, see what's there, which is a very inefficient and I think in a way it's ineffective. It's an ineffective way of consuming information. So I feel like we also need to move towards a search modality on social media, just as we need to do the same on traditional media. So that on traditional media, we say, I'm interested in top 3 topics, and this is what they are. And then I get the information fed to me, filtered the way I need it filtered from these 4 different outlets, by these 3 different reporters, etc. And I think that's a much better way of consuming news. And I think, and I hope social media will take the same direction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of it allows you to have a little bit more deliberate control of your consciousness, because otherwise there's so many people fighting to consume your attention and there's only so much time in the day. So if you think about like democracy as a resource system, effectively you're trying to convince a certain population of people to care about the thing that you want them to care about. And it seems that that system is now, it's accelerated so much at this point that you can't really browse through a newsfeed without finding something to care about, even if the thing that they've convinced you to care about isn't even related. So there's a lot of like the logical fallacies hooking people and so on.
Right.
We do have someone that's hopped up to speak. So, sir, if you'd like to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you're interested in.
Hi there, I'm Mehran. It's a pleasure joining you in this room. I was thinking about how users in a social media platform help a platform to eliminate other competitors in different ways.
Oh, I think we your mic cut out just a little bit through there. Oh, it looks like his connection's lost. Didn't entirely catch what he was saying. Did you get what he was getting at there, Ashley?
No, not quite. I think something about competition, crowding out other competitors, possibly. I don't exactly know. I do think there is great conversation to be had about competition in an information marketplace. I mean, obviously, that's like what you were just talking about, Al. Is like we have this cute phrase about letting people live rent free in your head, where today we're all kind of letting thousands of people riot rent free in our head. But I think what we're also seeing is this land grab by media, by big corporations, essentially. I mean, it's cliche to talk about it, but that is really what's going on here, and that's one of those major shifts that is culminated and peaked recently, where you have this enormous concentration of media in really 3 or 4 big companies, and we're talking about Comcast, Viacom, Disney, that level of big company. So there is a threat to other media because Disney, Comcast, Viacom, or whoever else can really bury competitors very easily, and they also have enough power to shut down stories by the New York Post, for example. We're seeing how that works. So
their PR agency will probably get a better time slot, right? They're always going to get the phone call before anybody else does.
Exactly, and for them, owning a newspaper is financially, it may not make lots of sense, but from the point of view of influence and power, it does. So losing the money or breaking even on whatever it is to finance a newspaper for year over year, it just might be worth it for them to take the loss or to not make any money at all, because they get power. And you think of like, what does Jeff Bezos want with the Washington Post? Like, it's obviously not financial, and he can fund it forever, but it gets him power that's almost impossible today to purchase. And that's why the New York Times is still roughly independent. It's controlled by a single family, because you can't buy that kind of influence. You literally can't. The New York Times, the family that controls it, they're not going to sell their control. They're not going to offer access to their control of the paper for any amount of money. It's not worth it to them because they know how valuable it is. So that's also kind of this weird anomaly in the media as a financial marketplace, in addition to an information marketplace, is that its value as an influence mechanism is vastly greater than its value as a financial industry or any individual financial company. So it leaves us in kind of a weird place where the market doesn't really work the same way in media.
There's not an effective competition, really. It's kind of the mental model that I find interesting is sort of like if there was an island discovered in the South Pacific that had an enormous amount of oil reserves, right? All of the existing oil companies would immediately compete to control all of that commodity as quickly as possible, because if they don't, then it's somebody else's competitive advantage, and then they have to actually fight for it. And so I think we're seeing this kind of clustering in the intention space right now, which is sort of what we're trying to fix with all this decentralized stuff, and hopefully it will move along in that direction. Kishan has joined as a speaker, and he's actually building a decentralized ad network out in India at the moment. Kishan, would you like to say a few words?
Oh, hello everyone. So I was hoping to get some ideas from you. How do you see the current advertising models that these digital platforms have right now, and how do you see them evolving in the future in the Web3 space and the technologies that we are seeing right now in the world? So what are your views on that, Ashley and Al, both of you?
When you mean the digital platforms, advertising a digital platform, do you mean on social media or on traditional media, or both?
Actually, the social media and the digital news media platforms, both of them, because that's the main business model that they have, from where they are generating the revenue and getting the money for building this platform. And without these money, they can't build this kind of platform. So how do you see these models going on in the future, and where are we heading in that direction?
Yeah. Great point. Al, do you want to fire away? Or?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. I think hopefully where this heads is not permissioning control of eyeballs so much as permissioning control of portals that have eyeballs. So kind of what we were talking about before is the idea that you can have a lot of different content, and then all of the gateways that allow people to view that content can have their own rules about how they present things in their newsfeed, or how they actually show promoted content or things like that. And I think hopefully what we move towards is a communal knowledge resource that exists as a decentralized storage system, something communally owned, something like Arweave would be very good. And then hopefully the portals themselves can prioritize different content based on promotions from their community. So actually we're seeing a lot of social media applications being built right now in this space that are kind of creating their own network token, which they issue based on loyalty. And then they use that network token to also have internal advertising or priority systems, or ways of kind of reaching you for more clout and exposure, which I think is ultimately the point of a lot of advertising now, is more about getting exposure and getting the chance to explain your idea to people, as opposed to the old kind of Madison Avenue, let's convince the whole world that Coke is happy. Which, that sort of model I don't know if that necessarily works anymore. You can't really pull the wool over people's eyes like that these days.
Yeah, it seems to be. I mean, in traditional media, advertising is kind of over, because you have basically unlimited ad inventories on digital, because you can just keep making more and more space. And there was never a great way to monetize those ads. So most traditional legacy media brands see their future in subscription. They're not looking at advertising anymore as their bread and butter. And that brings with it a whole other set of issues, including the fact that if you are basing your revenue on subscription, you're really kind of preaching to 2 to 3% of your total crowd, of your total audience, who are actually going to subscribe. So there is an effect there that some of these outlets are becoming more extreme in their content, because they're trying to please their base. And the New York Times is a great example of that. And I think on social media, we're seeing a lot of interesting stuff happen. I mean, Facebook has, in the last, I don't know what it's been, 6 months or so, with the changes to Apple's privacy policies, it's a complete ground swell. It's a game change, because Facebook is not enabling its customers, its advertisers, to reach and to track their targets as well as it used to be able to. So people are walking away from it. Advertisers are walking away. And on Twitter, I think, I personally think, I had a tweet thread about this a few weeks ago. I personally think that the advertising model is damaging to the platform, and that a freemium model of some sort is a much better approach. And that's something that Musk has been talking about on Twitter as well recently. I think he tweeted about it today, even, that in the future, most users will still be free, but some commercial and government users will be paid. I think that makes a lot more sense in advertising, because advertisers end up having too much power. The New York Times advertising on Twitter, paying them millions of dollars a year or a month, will have drastically more power than any user, any group of users ever will. And that's not where we want a social media platform to be. So there's a lot happening, and a swirl of change, each industry changing in a different way, in a different direction, which means I think there's a lot of opportunity, probably for business, but definitely for just making all these things better for people.
Yeah, I think the opportunity here is enormous to be able to kind of gradually bring more people into the fold with a lot of these things as well. Like, for example, if you do have a freemium model, then you can start to implement all kinds of value-added features and start to create smaller communities and things that would just not be sustainable under that kind of big tent mentality that we were kind of talking about before. So an interesting landscape. If there's no one else that wants to jump up to speak, I think we can probably wrap things up here. I really appreciate your insight, Ashley. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I hope we've probably illuminated some things for a lot of the people here. Usually these get a lot of listenership after the fact too. So if there's anybody listening that's listening to the recording in the future, you can always reach out on Twitter, tweet at Koii, tweet at Ashley, tweet at me. Really love to hear what people think and try to keep the discussion going, because that's kind of how we're going to find the right path in the future here. But yeah, thank you again for joining. Do you have any last thoughts? Anything in case our new owner of Twitter happens to be listening to this in the future? Is there anything we should say to him?
I think the thing I would say to Elon Musk at this point is, like, good on you. This was maybe there, and I'm sure there is some hidden business logic here that he sees that I don't. But I also see an enormous headache for someone who was trying to take on this massively important platform and fix it, make it better for people. And I think that's what we are seeing. So I think it's an incredibly encouraging moment. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the world's greatest innovator has chosen this project, and that this project requires the world's greatest innovator. So it's a great moment to be part of this and to be in this environment.
I do hope, though, that eventually we can turn over the keys to some extent to a little bit more of a broader governance space. But I totally agree with you. It's nice to see at least some change happening now. If we can start to move in the right direction, things will get a lot better. Well, thank you again for joining, and thank you everybody for listening. This has been a really great discussion. Hope to catch you all next time.